Imagine, you wake up in a world where the silence is louder than any scream. A world where each new day brings not the dawn, but only fresh news of death. Your neighbors, with whom you shared bread yesterday, have vanished without a trace. The streets, once filled with life, laughter, and commerce, are now empty, echoing corridors. A heavy, sweet smell of decay and burning hangs in the air, seeping through shuttered windows and staining your memory. This is not the plot of an apocalyptic film. This is not the fiction of a novelist's imagination. This is the reality, seared into the pages of history. The reality of the 14th century. An epidemic, which posterity would call the Black Death, came without warning and spared no one. It claimed the lives of tens of millions, redrew the map of the world, and forever changed the course of human civilization. Today, we will not merely recount the dry facts. We will immerse ourselves in the chilling horror of those times. We will walk through the deserted cities, hear the echoes of prayers and curses, and look into the eyes of those who faced the greatest nightmare in history. This is a journey into an age when death walked openly through towns and villages, and the sole purpose of every person became the most primal instinct of all, to survive. It all began in the East, like a distant, barely perceptible whisper. In the mid-1330s, strange rumors began to emerge from the depths of Asia, from the lands of the mysterious Golden Horde. Merchants leading their caravans along the Great Silk Road told tales in the taverns of Genoa and Venice of an unseen pestilence that was mowing down people in the steppes and cities of distant China and India. They spoke of entire settlements wiped out in a matter of weeks, of land that could no longer accept all the dead into its soil. But for Europe, mired in its feudal wars and courtly intrigues, these stories sounded like another fairy tale from the other side of the world. Too far away. Too unreal. The caravans continued their journey. Camels, laden with precious silks, porcelain, and sacks of fragrant spices, slowly crossed deserts and mountains. But along with the goods that promised fabulous profits, they carried an invisible, silent, and deadly passenger. Its carriers were common black rats, which scurried in the holds of ships and carts, and the fleas that parasitized them. It was in the blood of these tiny creatures that the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the cause of the plague, was hiding. When the first caravanners began to drop dead, suffering from fever, coughing up blood, and covered in dark, pus-filled buboes, no one thought much of it. The arduous journey, bad water, exhaustion, there could be many reasons. But the disease had already begun its great march. It moved along the arteries of trade like poison through veins. By 1346, the plague had reached the prosperous trading cities of the Golden Horde on the lower Don and Volga rivers. One such center was Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, a Genoese fortress in the Crimea. When the Mongol army of Khan Janibeg besieged the city, an epidemic broke out among his troops. Chronicles state that the Mongols, unable to take the fortress by storm, resorted to the first documented act of biological warfare in history. They began using catapults to hurl the corpses of their plague-dead soldiers into the city. The stench of decay filled Kaffa, but with it came terror. The disease began to cut down the city's defenders as well. In a panic, the Genoese merchants fled to their ships and sailed away, hoping to escape the curse. But they did not know they were taking it with them. October 1347. 12 Genoese trading galleys, returning from Kaffa, limped into the bustling port of Messina, Sicily. On the shore, families and merchants awaited them, anticipating a rich haul. But what they saw made their blood run cold. The ships were like floating tombs. The sails hung in tattered rags. The decks were a scene of chaos. Most of the crew were dead. The few who were still breathing were living ghosts. Their bodies were covered in black sores. They were delirious with unbearable pain, and they died before the very eyes of the crowd gathered on the pier. The authorities in Messina, seized by a superstitious horror, immediately ordered the death ships to be driven out of the harbor. But it was too late. The invisible enemy had already come ashore. The rats, the main carriers of the infection, were the first to leave the doomed vessels, scurrying down the mooring ropes and vanishing into the port warehouses full of grain, and from there into the cellars and homes of the unsuspecting townspeople. The fleas followed, having already found new human hosts. The nightmare began. First, The dock workers and their families fell ill. Then, the disease swept through the city like a river of fire. People died so quickly it seemed as if the very air had become poisonous. Within weeks, the prosperous city of Messina had turned into a ghost town. The survivors fled in panic, spreading the contagion further across Sicily. Those same Genoese galleys, expelled from Messina, continued their deadly voyage. They docked in Genoa and Marseille, and the scenario repeated with horrifying precision. Every port these black ships entered became a new epicenter of the epidemic. Soon, the entire coast of Europe was ablaze. From the port cities, the disease crept inland along rivers and roads, following merchants, pilgrims, and refugees. The moment those 12 galleys entered the harbor of Messina was the point of no return. The countdown for the most terrifying pandemic in European history had begun. The news of the great pestilence spread faster than the disease itself, sowing panic and irrational terror. The once bustling streets of European cities turned into desolate labyrinths, where the sound of one's own footsteps seemed deafening. Doors were bolted shut, windows boarded up. Neighbor ceased to trust neighbor. Family members looked at each other with suspicion. Any sign of illness, a cough, a fever, a weakness, was seen as a death sentence, not just for the sick person, but for everyone around them. Society, built on social bonds and faith, began to disintegrate. No one knew what to do. Doctors, with their primitive methods of bloodletting and cauterization, were powerless. They themselves were often among the first to die. People then turned to the only power they believed could help: God. The churches were overflowing. Day and night, prayers and penitential psalms were unceasing. But people died right there, during the services, and faith began to crack. If this was God's punishment, then for what? For what sins had God unleashed such wrath upon humanity? Desperation bred monstrous acts. Some tried to appease the higher powers through self-mortification. Processions of flagellants moved along the roads of Europe. People who whipped themselves bloody in public, believing they were taking on the sins of the world to stop the plague. Others, in contrast, decided that if the end of the world was near, there was no point in morality or restraint. Cities were swept by waves of looting and debauchery. In desperation, people burned the houses of the infected, sometimes with the living still inside. Authorities issued decrees forbidding strangers from entering cities, but it was no use. The sick were driven out into the streets, condemned to die alone. Parents abandoned their children, children their parents. Entire neighborhoods were deserted as all their inhabitants either died or fled. But the disease was relentless. It did not distinguish between the righteous and the sinner, the rich and the poor. It simply marched forward, and chaos followed in its wake. In a world where science had not yet been born, and every phenomenon was explained by divine will or devilish machinations, the true nature of the enemy remained a mystery. The people of the 14th century had no concept of bacteria or viruses. They looked for the cause of their suffering in something visible, something their minds could grasp. The most popular theory was that of miasma, poisonous vapors that were believed to rise from swamps or the Earth's core, corrupting the air. It was thought that a bad smell was the disease itself. Therefore, people burned aromatic herbs in bonfires on the streets, carried bouquets of flowers and pomanders, and fumigated their homes with incense. But this, of course, did not help. When prayers and perfumes failed, the search for culprits began. The human mind needed an enemy to direct its fear and anger towards, and that enemy was found. The first to fall under suspicion were the poor, lepers, and foreigners. But the primary target became the Jewish communities. Monstrous rumors spread across Europe that the Jews had poisoned the wells and springs to wipe out the Christian population. This conspiracy theory fell on the fertile ground of centuries of religious intolerance. Mass persecutions and brutal pogroms began. People were seized, tortured into confessing to crimes they did not commit, and then burned alive, entire communities at a time. The tragedy was that Jewish communities, thanks to their sanitary precepts and more isolated lifestyle, sometimes suffered less from the plague, which in the eyes of the maddened crowds only served as proof of their guilt. The real enemy, however, remained in the shadows. It hid not in poisoned wells, but in granaries, in the holds of ships, in the cellars of houses, and even in the straw mattresses where people slept. Common black rats and their fleas. They were the army of the invisible invader. They traveled with humans, sharing their food and shelter. Every sack of flour, every merchant's wagon, every ship that docked at the shore could be a deadly trap. People looked for an enemy in the heavens and among non-believers, but it was right under their feet, unseen, silent, and incredibly efficient. From the port cities, the plague spread across Europe, turning it into a giant graveyard. The great centers of civilization, Paris, Florence, London, Hamburg, were suffocating from death. Millions of inhabitants, bustling markets, magnificent cathedrals, and then, suddenly, a deafening, unnatural silence. In Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, the mortality rate was so high that the writer Giovanni Boccaccio, a witness to the events, wrote in his Decameron, "How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, how many gallant youths did breakfast in the morning with their kinsfolk, comrades and friends, and that same night supped with their ancestors in the other world." In some parts of the city, up to half, or even two-thirds, of the population perished. The streets were littered with corpses. At first, people tried to bury them with Christian rites, but soon there were so many dead that there were not enough grave diggers, and they themselves died one after another. The authorities then hired special men, beccamorti, who drove through the city at night with carts, shouting, "Bring out your dead." The bodies were piled onto the carts like firewood and taken to huge mass graves outside the city, where they were buried by the hundreds, without coffins or funeral services. The bells, which once tolled for each deceased person, now rang so often that their sound merged into one continuous, maddening drone. Eventually, the authorities in many cities simply forbade the ringing of bells to avoid worsening the panic and despair of the living. The situation in the countryside was no better. Entire villages died out completely. Fields were left unharvested, livestock roamed unattended. A traveler on the road could enter a village and find not a single living soul, only the wide-open doors of houses and silence. Death was no longer a tragedy. It became a routine. People lost all hope. Fear gave way to apathy and fatalism. It seemed as if the apocalypse had arrived and humanity was doomed. And yet, even in this kingdom of death, some managed to survive. Amidst the universal chaos and despair, there were those who intuitively found the right strategies for salvation. They were not the strongest, not the richest, nor the most pious. The ones who survived were those who knew how to be cautious, who were not afraid of total isolation. The most effective method proved to be quarantine. The term itself would appear later, but the principle was discovered then. Wealthy families who owned country villas locked themselves away in them for months on end. They brought supplies of food and water, servants, and guards, and completely cut off all contact with the outside world. This is precisely what the characters in Boccaccio's Decameron did. 7 young women and 3 young men who took refuge from the Florentine plague in a villa and passed the time by telling each other stories. Less affluent people living in cities also tried to isolate themselves. They boarded up the doors and windows of their homes, and food was passed to them through windows using ropes. Some communities, especially in remote mountain or forest regions, cut themselves off from the world. They posted armed guards on all roads leading to their settlement and allowed no one in or out. Any traveler who approached their borders risked being killed without warning. It was brutal, but it worked. Some cities showed surprising organization. In Milan, for example, when the sick were discovered in a house, the city's ruler ordered that the house be immediately walled up, condemning everyone inside, both sick and healthy, to death. This inhumane method, however, allowed Milan to suffer significantly less from the plague than other Italian cities. These were humanity's first, intuitive steps in the fight against epidemics. People learned from their own bitter experience the fundamental law of survival. To defeat a disease transmitted from person to person, you had to break its deadly chain. Isolation, distance, control, these principles, discovered in the fire of the Black Death, would form the basis of future epidemiology and save countless lives in the centuries to come. Against the backdrop of universal horror, strange, sinister figures began to appear on the streets of the dying cities, their appearance still one of the most recognizable symbols of the plague. These were the plague doctors. They wore long coats made of waxed or oiled leather, gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, and the most terrifying part of their attire, a mask with a long, bird-like beak. This costume was not the product of a sick imagination. It was considered the cutting-edge personal protective equipment of its time. The coat was intended to prevent contact between the skin and the patient or the miasma. The long, hollow beak of the mask had a very practical purpose. It was filled with strongly scented herbs, spices, and flowers, lavender, mint, cloves, camphor. Glass eyepieces protected the eyes. In his hand, the doctor held a long wooden cane to avoid touching patients directly. He used it to examine them, turn them over, and fend off desperate relatives. These doctors were not the elite of the medical profession. Often, they were either young, aspiring physicians or charlatans who agreed to the deadly work for an enormous salary paid by city authorities. Their methods of treatment were barbaric and useless. They would lance and cauterize the plague buboes, apply leeches, prescribe strange potions, and advise patients to pray. They could not cure the plague. Almost none of their patients survived, and the doctors themselves quickly became infected and died. Nevertheless, they fulfilled an important social function. They were the only ones who dared to enter infected homes. They recorded deaths for the city registers, gave advice on isolation, and supervised the burning of the deceased's clothing and belongings. For many people, abandoned by all, a visit from the plague doctor was their last human contact before death. But for most, this figure in the black mask, walking slowly down an empty street, became not a symbol of hope, but a harbinger of the end. Its appearance meant that death was already at the door. And this sinister image has been forever imprinted on the collective memory of humanity as the very embodiment of the horror of the Black Death. By 1351 to 1353, the first and most terrible wave of the plague began to subside. The disease did not disappear entirely. It would return to Europe again and again for several centuries, but never with such devastating force. The pandemic passed, leaving behind a continent changed beyond recognition. By various estimates, the Black Death claimed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. It was a demographic catastrophe of unprecedented scale. But, paradoxically, this tragedy became a catalyst for profound changes that ultimately led to the end of the Middle Ages and the birth of the modern era. The deaths of millions led to an acute labor shortage. The peasants and artisans who survived suddenly realized their value. They began to demand higher wages for their labor and better living conditions. The feudal system, based on the cheap labor of serfs, began to tremble and crumble. This gave a powerful impetus to the development of freer economic relations. A colossal blow was dealt to the authority of the church. People saw that prayers did not save them from the disease, that priests died just like commoners. This gave rise to a wave of skepticism and contributed to the growth of a secular worldview that would flourish during the Renaissance. Fear of the disease forced people to think about hygiene and public health. City authorities began to take the first steps toward creating sanitary services, introducing quarantine measures for arriving ships, and organizing hospitals for infectious diseases. Medicine, which had shown its complete helplessness, was forced to reconsider its dogmas. A slow but steady shift began from medieval scholasticism to scientific methods based on observation and experience. The Black Death left a deep scar on the body of Europe. It brought immeasurable suffering and grief. But it also cleared the way for a new world. People understood a simple but vital truth. The survival of humanity depends not only on faith or strength, but on knowledge, reason, and the ability to learn from our most terrible mistakes. The plague left scars that have not healed in the collective memory of humanity to this day. It became an eternal reminder of how fragile our civilization is in the face of an unseen enemy. This story is not just a chapter from a history book. It is a warning about how quickly the familiar world can collapse, how easily fear can turn people into monsters, and how thin the line is between order and chaos. But it was this catastrophe that taught humanity caution. It gave us the first, primitive, but vital tools to fight pandemics: quarantine, isolation, public hygiene. The lessons, paid for with the lives of tens of millions, formed the foundation of modern medicine and epidemiology. Every time we wash our hands to protect ourselves from a virus, every time doctors put on protective gear, we are, without realizing it, paying tribute to the memory of those who went through the hell of the Black Death. History shows that even in the darkest, most hopeless of times, humanity always has a chance. A chance to survive, a chance to learn, a chance to become stronger. Having endured the greatest pandemic, humanity did not just persevere. It changed in order to step into a new era. And we are obliged to remember such lessons written by death itself. For only by remembering the past can we look to the future with hope, no matter how uncertain it may seem. The story of the Black Death is not just a tale of tragedy. It is a saga of survival and the resilience of the human spirit, about how, in the face of total annihilation, new ideas that change the world are born. If you enjoyed this story and want to learn more about the disasters that shaped our civilization and about the people who managed to endure in inhuman conditions, please support our channel. Subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss new episodes. There are many more stories ahead that will make your heart stop and make you think about the eternal. Thank you for your time. Until next time.